I'm Roberta Glass, and you're listening to my True Crime Report. On October 24th, 2011, in Potsdam, New York, 12-year-old Garrett Phillips was found in the home he shared with his mother and half-brother, Aaron, hanging on to life and suffering from what would become fatal injuries. His mother's Jamaican ex-boyfriend, Oral Nick Hillary, was tried and acquitted for the crime in 2016. The case was the subject for the HBO documentary Who Killed Garrett Phillips? The documentary argues that Hillary was the victim of a racially motivated witch hunt, but like so many true crime documentaries, leaves out much of the prosecution's case. To talk to me about this case is Thomas J Mortati. A graduate of Fordham and Albany Law School, Tom has been a practicing defense attorney specializing in personal injury, medical malpractice, law enforcement, construction, and products liability. Now he works for the plaintiff side. He has litigated cases both in the state and federal court and made news in 2019 when he obtained a record $7.436 million verdict in the St. Lawrence County Supreme Court in a medical malpractice case. He has been featured in the aforementioned HBO documentary Who Killed Garrett Phillips, as well as the 2020 episode Rear Window about this case. And Garrett Phillips is the subject of today's episode. Welcome, Thomas J Mortati. And thanks so much for doing this interview.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
So you're a civil litigator. Why are we talking about a criminal case, and how did you get involved in this case?
So, yes, my entire career has been in the world of civil litigation, almost 30 years now, 26 of which was on the defense, primarily civil defense side. In the last 3 years, I had moved over to the plaintiff side. So how I got involved in a murder case was I did work for an insurance company that insured the village of Potsdam, New York, and they were sued by Mr. Hillary. There were some things that occur before the actual lawsuit that are unique somewhat to New York, where we got to take testimony from Mr. Hillary before there was even a lawsuit. And I was contacted by the insurance company for the village of Potsdam to handle the claim, as they, called it, and go take testimony and get involved in this thing. And that began a multi-year odyssey working with multiple law enforcement agencies and district attorneys' offices, et cetera, in terms of the investigation of the homicide murder of Garrett Phillips that occurred on October 24th, 2011.
So what was Nick Hillary suing Potsdam for?
So he first had to do something in New York that's called a notice of claim. So in New York State, if you want to bring a lawsuit against a municipality, so in this case, the village of Potsdam, and he wanted to sue them for what he claimed was defamation, false arrest, illegal detention, things of that nature, he had to first file what's called a notice of claim that got served on the village of Potsdam. That eventually got sent to me, and then I got to take testimony from him for that initially in 2012. After that was done, he then was free to go file a lawsuit, which he initially filed in St. Lawrence County Supreme Court, and I removed it to federal court because he had various federal claims involved and was essentially suing for false arrest and defamation of character.
So You're kind of in a strange position because basically you're on the side saying he wasn't falsely arrested. There was a reason for his arrest. That's basically what you were trying to prove.
Correct. In fact, my defense was to prove that he killed Garrett Phillips. And again, I'm in the civil context, so my burden of proof, if you will, is going to be preponderance of evidence is more likely than not. It's not, the reasonable doubt standard you have in a criminal case. So this was a very, very unusual scenario where I'm going and taking sworn testimony from a guy who is the unnamed prime suspect in the strangulation and asphyxiation murder of a 12-year-old boy who, initially is questioned by the police, but once that turns to any questions about his whereabouts, he clams up, invokes his right to counsel, which he's entitled to do. And now he brings this civil action where he has to testify under oath to me about pretty much anything and everything related to his whereabouts, etc., because in the civil world, as a plaintiff, so if you bring a lawsuit, you can't refuse to testify in the civil world. If you do, your case is eventually going to get dismissed. So he had to testify. Why they went through with this is beyond me, because had Mr. Hillary and his attorney not brought this thing, this case would have remained unsolved and never would have moved forward at all, ever.
Oh, that's interesting. So you refer to this case as solved.
My personal opinion is it's quite clear that, Nick Hillary was the perpetrator of this crime. No question in my mind at all. Other people may differ, but I think the evidence proved that I understand that there was a criminal trial and the judge acquitted him in that bench trial. But I still firmly believe that he got away with it.
Yeah, I came to the same conclusion. After reading your depositions, there was no doubt left. Why was Nick Hillary, indicted and ultimately arrested? What made the police hone in on him?
You got to wind the clock back all the way to October 24 of 2011. Mr. Hillary, it became clear very early on that he wasn't being forthright with the police and honest. He was the only one. He was also the only one who refused to cooperate in any fashion with the police. So as they were ruling out other people, other former boyfriends of Tandy Cyrus, the mother of Garrett Phillips, they were also focusing on Nick Hillary, no question about it. And eventually there was no one else left, if you will. And definitely the focus early on was also on Mr. Hillary. And then they kind of get to a stopping point or a dead end, if you will. They're waiting on DNA evidence. There's no smoking gun at this point. So back in November 2011, early 2012, keep in mind when Garrett Phillips is discovered, it's not like there's a knife sticking out of his chest or a bullet hole in him. He's actually alive when he's first found. He's unconscious and unresponsive, but he's still alive. It's not even clear that there was any crime at all committed until after EMS comes. They grab him, they work on him, they go literally, a quarter mile, half mile down the road to Canton Potsdam Hospital. And it's only after that the police are walking around and they realize, someone else was in here and someone escaped out a second floor window. Why would you need to do that? And that's what starts the investigation into his death, first of all. And then over time, and most specifically, the information developed in the what we call 50H testimony, the sworn testimony I took from him in his notice of claim back on April 30th of 2012. And then the extended version, if you want to call it that, January 20th of 2014, I did a 6.5, 7-hour videotape deposition of Mr. Hillary. Those deposition transcripts were used as part of the basis to proceed with moving forward with a grand jury. And I know for the trial, they used about 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours of, let's call it the greatest hits of Nick Hillary's video deposition testimony to present to the judge. It was originally going to be a jury trial, but halfway through jury selection, the defense elected to go with a bench trial. And we can talk about the hows and whys later, but
right.
That's a long answer to your question of why was he ultimately indicted and arrested.
Can you talk about that leap from that second story window, the actual physicality of it?
So this building where Tandy Cyrus lived with her two boys, Garrett Phillips, who was 12 at the time, and Aaron Collins, who I believe was 8 at the time. This is an old Victorian-ish style apartment building. We're talking, 12-foot ceilings inside. So when you're on the second floor, it's a pretty far drop down from the second floor backside window to the ground. And in fact, what happens is the windows, these are old-fashioned, casement windows that slide up and down. And then there's a screen that's attached to the outside. That was retrofitted long after this building was constructed. The screen is pushed out, the blinds are pushed out, and again, I believe it was Mr. Hillary who would have actually had to go out that window, drop down a significant distance, about 8 or 10 feet, to what is essentially kind of like an outbuilding connected to the backside or the side of the building, and then jump from there to the grass ground below. So, you have to be somewhat in good physical condition and athletic to be able to do these things and not get yourself killed.
And it was unclear in the documentary, I'm not sure if it's the 2020 or the actual documentary, whether he has a limp or not. But when you deposed him, Nick Hillary admitted that he had hurt his ankle. What is his story and how did it change?
Interesting point there. So, Mr. Hillary and his supporters, long claimed that when the police videotaped him on the night of October 25th of 2011, he was coaching at I believe it was Clarkson soccer team and soccer against SUNY Potsdam. The camera work, I will tell you, it's a little bit shaky. There are times it appears that he's limping. There are times that it appears he's not limping. But the fact of the matter is, when I took testimony from him in April of 2012, he conceded and admitted to me under oath that in the week prior to October 26th, because that's the day he's first brought in for questioning, but in that week before, he claims and admits he sprained his ankle and he injured his ankle, had an abrasion on the outside of the right ankle. And this was significant because the police felt that whoever had done this very well may have suffered an injury from jumping first down to the outbuilding roof, then from that to the ground below. There was, in the damp grass on the ground below, there was a skid mark where someone's foot had clearly, their shoe had hit the ground and, the grass pulled out from under it. So unfortunately, because it was drizzling, there was no, shoe print or anything to be gathered from that beyond just photographing it. So his story is I injured my ankle, I sprained my ankle, and I caused this abrasion on the right outside ankle. And he says that, that happened when I was moving furniture around in my apartment. Again, he originally told me it was a week before. And then when I took his testimony in January of 2014, he tried to say, it actually occurred in September when I first moved into the apartment. And I pulled out his prior testimony and explained and showed to him how, no. You previously told me under oath that it happened in that week immediately before Garrett was murdered. These two answers obviously don't match anymore. And he ultimately, and I think reluctantly, conceded that, no, you're right. I injured it a week before the murder. And the reason that was important was, Mr. Hillary's supporters kept saying, he wasn't limping. He didn't have an injury. Well, no, he said he had an injury. He told me it was sprained, it was swollen, and he had the abrasion. To explain why that was important, at the trial, I believe it was the medical examiner looking at the photos taken up close of that abrasion. It's a very fresh-looking abrasion on the 26th when he's photographed. And the testimony and opinion given was that couldn't have been more than 48 hours to 72 hours old. So it must have happened on or around the 24th of October, the day of the murder.
Yeah, it's a really exciting piece of the deposition because he says, when I moved into the apartment, and you pick up right away because you know exactly when he moved into that apartment. So, and you jumped on it and you said, oh, wait, that's like September. So to me, reading it, it was just as exciting as other parts, and we'll get to that, of when he puts himself in the parking lot. And we'll get to that. But first, I want to talk about just the arrest, his behavior in the police station. So he brings along his family attorney, and the police notice some odd behavior when they order in pizza and around his smoking. Can you talk about that?
So let me back up for a second. On the morning of October 26th, which I believe was Wednesday, 2011, the then Lieutenant Murray, now Chief Murray, the Potsdam Police, and Gary Snell, who was a member of the New York State Bureau of Criminal Investigation, essentially a state police detective, went to Nick's apartment around 7:30 or so in the morning and said, hey, can you come down to the station and talk to us? And he said, sure. And he comes down, followed them in his own vehicle, and they spend maybe half hour, 40 minutes talking about some of the other kids that Garrett might have known. And then when things turn to pertinent questions, essentially of, where were you on the night of the 24th kind of thing, he immediately clams up, I'm not talking to you. I'm not here to talk about me. He refuses to answer any questions. It's at that point that he wants to leave, and the police detain him and read him his rights, his Miranda warning. And that's when he calls Jane Garland. That's his local family court attorney. I can tell you that that's not the first person he reached out to, though, after the murder. So Mr. Hillary's attorney in the initial civil action was this gentleman, Manai Trifari. I believe his real name was Howard Beckwith, but he changed his name in law school, I think. They were good friends from their college days at St. Lawrence University in Canton, which is just a few miles down the road from Potsdam. And the very first person that Nick Hillary reaches out to through his cell phone after Garrett is killed is actually Mr. Trifari. And there are multiple communications later that evening after the police reach out to Nick on the evening of the 24th. But back to your question on the 26th, He calls Jane Garland. The police can't ask him any more questions because he's invoked his right to counsel. And they are, at that point, they're literally writing up the search warrants for his person, eventually the search warrant for his car. And those search warrants were signed off on. They had to go find the local judge, and he signed off on those warrants, I believe, at about 3:45, maybe that afternoon. So Nick is at the Potsdam police station this whole time while they're waiting on the warrants. So one of the things I think you were referring to was at some point when Jane Garland gets there, roughly noonish, the police have ordered some pizza for Nick. And at this point, Nick is placed in the Potsdam Police Department kitchen. There's no video in there, but there is a state police representative who's tasked to basically watch him, and his attorney. He can't hear them, but he's able to watch through the window. Anyway, Mr. Hillary has eaten some of the pizza, and he and Jane Garland have some sort of discussion. And the real odd thing about it is she ends up taking that piece of pizza and takes a bite of it, according to the state police representative, and then puts the remains of it in her purse to take away. I mean, it's like, who does that? And even earlier to that, Mr. Hillary was allowed to smoke a cigarette in Lieutenant Murray's office, where there is a video recording system, so there's video of this. And he stands by a window and he smokes for a little bit. He chats with one of the officers who was placed in there to just simply babysit him. And you don't notice it the first time you watch the video, but the first cigarette he smokes, he doesn't just stub it out in the ashtray and leave it there. He actually very, very carefully and very slowly takes what remains of the cigarette and essentially field strips it and crumbles it into like dust and dribbles it around the floor, and then puts the very tiny little remains in his pocket. And if you're not watching the first time, you won't see it. You have to look for it. Again, it begs the question, who does that? Who clearly doesn't want his DNA to be surreptitiously obtained? And he even smoked a cigarette or two, I believe, in the kitchen at the police station, and he stuffed those cigarette butts down the sink drain, which they ultimately disassembled the sink drain and retrieved them, and that's where they got the initial DNA sample from Mr. Hillary. They eventually got a formal sample in the context of the criminal case much later, where he officially, had to come down with his attorneys and give a sample, but that's how they finally got the first DNA sample on him. But most unusual scenario.
But he's very willing to give his fingerprints.
Well, he had to. It wasn't that he was willing.
Okay.
So they got a search warrant. Remember, the Potsdam Police Department writes up a search warrant. That search warrant is reviewed by the local judge. The judge signs it. And at that point, they have the right to search his person. And they get his fingerprints. They photograph him. Mr. Hillary and his supporters have made a big deal out of, he was, quote unquote, stripped naked. Well, the state police performed that photographing inspection, and they slowly but surely photographed all of his clothing while it was on him. As he removed each piece of clothing, they obviously photographed his ankle. But yes, they stripped him down because they were looking to see if he had any defensive wounds. And the only reason that he was subject to that type of photographing was he was the only one who refused to cooperate. John Jones, others, they gave voluntary DNA samples. They voluntarily gave statements. They gave fingerprints. They allowed their arms and legs to be photographed. He wouldn't do it. So on the morning of the 26th, they asked him, hey, can you show us your ankle? And he says, no, not doing it.
I can hear the Nick Hillary supporters in the audience in my head screaming, well, what about the fingerprint on the window that the killer escaped from? What's that from? What's your opinion on that?
So interesting question. So the fingerprint is never identified. It's never matched to anyone. They went back, obviously, fingerprints of the people who lived there. So that would be Tandy, Aaron, Garrett, people who may have visited there, maintenance people. No one was ever able to figure out who that fingerprint belonged to. So, Mr. Hillary's supporters obviously said, aha, this proves it couldn't have been him. All it proves is that fingerprint wasn't Mr. Hillary's. The belief was that he was wearing gloves at the time of this attack, so there wouldn't have been fingerprints. And they just don't know whose fingerprint that was. I mean, Garrett lived there, Aaron lived there, Tandy lived there. None of their fingerprints are on a window that, in theory, they had opened and touched a number of times over the 2 months they had lived there. The other interesting thing about it is, keep in mind that Mr. Hillary's supporters have consistently claimed that John Jones was the real killer. Well, the fingerprint didn't match John Jones either. So you can't have it both ways.
That's a great point. And John Jones and Nick Hillary have a history We can talk about that maybe in a little bit. I
Okay.
just want to talk about maybe some of the more important evidence in this case,
Yeah.
like the video of Nick Hillary in the parking lot. What did
Sure.
Nick Hillary tell you about what he was doing in that parking lot, the weather conditions,
Sure.
during your depositions with him?
So there's security camera footage from Potsdam High School that shows the parking lot and some other areas. It captures parts of Leroy Street, which abuts the parking lot, which also abuts Canton Potsdam Hospital, where there were a whole bunch of other security cameras. So Mr. Hillary, he testifies that I went from my apartment, which is about a quarter to a third of a mile north of Potsdam High School on Leroy Street. He leaves his apartment complex. There's only one way in and out by vehicle, and that's onto Leroy Street. And he would have made a right turn, which he says he did. He made a right. He goes down southbound on Leroy, and he's going to make a left turn into the parking lot entrance. Now, that's the first inconsistency between the video and Mr. Hillary, because he claims I went from my apartment to the high school, and there's only one way you go to get there. I mean, anyone with half a brain would go that way, which he said he did. Make a right, go a quarter mile, make a left, you're there. If you made a left out of his apartment complex and drove basically 2 miles out of your way, you would never do that, and he says he didn't do it anyway. In any event, the important part about that is the video shows him turning into the parking lot from the opposite direction. So he's coming from somewhere else. He's not coming directly from his apartment as he claims. So that's inconsistency, or lie number one. So he turns right into the parking lot. The weather conditions on that afternoon. So, Potsdam, New York is well up into the North Country. Based on the video, you can see that it is drizzling out. There are people walking around, some with umbrellas and some without. Keep in mind that Mr. Hillary's testimony twice was that it was a torrential downpour. Those are his words. And that's why he never gets out of his car, okay? It's not a torrential downpour at any point during the time he's in that parking lot, based on the fact that there's a high school soccer game being played, let alone people walking around without umbrellas. So in any event, Roberta, so he makes this right off of Leroy Street, coming from the direction of Clarkson, basically, as opposed to the direction of his apartment, and turns into the parking lot, slowly drives down to where you can't go any further. There's essentially a circle. And now you're roughly 200 yards from the middle school, which is a straight shot through an open field and a sidewalk. Where he was initially parked, he's looking straight ahead at the middle school, which is the same sidewalk and direction that Garrett comes down on his ripstick. So Nick claims, of course, that he never saw Garrett, but conveniently he's there, of course, to go see a soccer game. Yet where he parks initially at this circle, he can't even see the field from where he's initially parked. There's both a school bus and a concession stand blocking his view of the field to his left. This is the game he allegedly came to go watch. But the one unobstructed view he has is directly ahead of him on a sidewalk that goes directly away from him towards the middle school, where we know Garrett is coming from. So he at some point moves after a minute or so. He drives around the circle, drives past the concession stand, past the school bus, and then turns right into one of the parking spots up against a fence and a stand of trees, where he yet again cannot see the field of the soccer game he's allegedly there to watch. And he never shuts the car off. He sits there in the car, and Garrett comes rip-sticking down the sidewalk that's behind him in the parking lot, okay, along the side of the high school. And Garrett comes to the end of that sidewalk, and now Garrett's at what is essentially, again, this T intersection with the high school parking lot and Leroy Street. And for Garrett to go home, he would go left on Leroy, make a right on Cottage, go to the end of Cottage and make a left on Market and be at his house, which was approximately a half mile total from that parking lot to his apartment house. So I might have gotten sidetracked, Roberta. So I know there was more in there.
How this case is reduced to is that the only evidence is that he took a left following Garrett when he should have taken a right going home. but he was really going to see, he says, his assistant coach to tell his coach that he was going to be at practice. He had to see him in person in this day and age of cell phones and everything. He had to go by his house to say, I'll meet you at the practice in 40 minutes or whatever, because he was the soccer coach for Clarkson University.
Keep in mind that, Nick Hillary says to me under oath, and I boxed him in quite specifically on this, that I went straight home from the parking lot. I stopped nowhere. I spoke to no one. I saw no one. I mean, he even says he never sees anybody the whole time he's in the parking lot. And he admits to me the way to go home, the fastest way to go home, and the way you would go home is to make a right turn out of the parking lot. And again, he went straight home, spoke to no one. He did not go to Ian Fairley's apartment first. He made that very clear. I clarified that with him. So he would have made a right turn out of the parking lot. But what happens is, about 7 seconds maybe after Garrett passes behind Nick's car on the sidewalk, Nick's brake lights come on. He pulls out or backs out of the parking spot, goes in the same direction towards the Leroy Street exit, and turns left in the same direction as Garrett, and you never see Nick again, which is directly inconsistent with his testimony that I went straight home, I would have made a right, that's the fastest way home, I went nowhere, I stopped nowhere, I saw no one. The Ian Fairley thing for Mr. Hillary, and from his version of events, that occurs after he goes back home, allegedly, to his apartment for approximately 15 to 25 minutes, and he leaves at about 5:15 and comes back down Leroy Street and makes a right on Garden Street to go see Mr. Fairley. One of the important things about this case, by the way, is when you lock Mr. Hillary into what his story is to where he went, you can go back and look at cameras and you can see where he was and where he wasn't. So importantly, there's no Nick Hillary 2009 light blue Honda CRV coming down Leroy Street that passes the camera at the high school or the hospital between 5 and 5:30. So his claim that he went home, stays for whatever, 15, 20 minutes, and then comes back down the street, it defies logic and evidence when, in fact, there's no video proof because he doesn't show up on that camera. Same thing with, him going left out of the parking lot. Normally if you did that, I turned the wrong way. You would make a U-turn, go back the other way. You don't see him do that. Or if he went down any of the side streets and went over to Market Street, he would have gone up Market Street and passed several security cameras, such as at the Sunoco, or cut down one of the side streets by the hospital. He doesn't show up on any of those cameras, ever. So we know where he wasn't, by virtue of the fortuitous nature of security cameras in and around Potsdam and back, this is almost 9 years ago now.
That's a good point. And the other thing he says in the deposition is that he had a great relationship with Garrett. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that he broke up with Tandy, or Tandy broke up with him, he can't remember which, because the kids were having trouble adjusting to the living situation. And that's a quote. What do you know about his relationship with Tandy Cyrus?
Nick Hillary and Tandy start dating in October of 2010. Nick, by all accounts, meets her. She was, I believe, part-time bartending at a bar up there, and he walks in. Keep in mind that he, at the time, is living with his common-law wife, Stacia Lee. I think she's still a nurse at the hospital there. Mother of his daughter, Shanna Kay, and a son, or maybe even two sons at the time. And he's living with Stacia Lee at that time. And he meets Tandy, and he starts seeing Tandy. And Stacia is not very happy about this, by the way, because she throws him and all his stuff out of the house roughly October of 2010. He actually filed a criminal complaint against her for breaking his stuff, basically, but and nothing ever came of it. That was, again, October of 2010. So Nick and Tandy start living together on Spring Street in January of 2011. So Tandy has her two boys, Garrett and Aaron, and Nick has custody of Shanna Kay. The other kids, the boys, are with Stacia Lee, and they come to visit periodically. So Garrett is not happy about this scenario, and he and Nick do not get along. And unfortunately, or whatever, Nick is the only one who says they had this wonderful relationship. There's not any other person that I've ever taken testimony from, interviewed, or spoken to who corroborates this quote-unquote wonderful relationship. Garrett didn't like Nick. Nick didn't like Garrett.
And how did Nick Hillary take the breakup?
If you ask Nick, everything was fine, and he helped move her into her new apartment in late August, early September of 2011. However, he actually told several people that he felt Tandy was letting a 12-year-old, her son Garrett, run her life and ruin her life. He actually goes to Janet and Joseph Paul, that's Tandy's mother and stepfather. They both worked at Clarkson University as well. Joe worked in the maintenance department. Janet was custodial staff. And he seeks them out in August-ish, September 2011, at where they are on the campus. Now, keep in mind, this is parts of the campus he would have no reason to go to. He's the soccer coach. He shouldn't be going to some construction work being done on one of the dorms when school's not even in session. And he basically goes to both of them to plead with them, if you will, that, she's made a mistake. She needs to get back to me. He also approached Tandy's sister, Tanya, about the same thing. Nick denied that any of these took place and essentially said these people were all making it up.
Wow. So the other argument that the documentary makes is that the police should have never set their sights on Nick Hillary because he had an ironclad alibi, which was his daughter, Shanna Kay, and that he was at home with her, and you deposed her. How did her story hold up?
Not particularly well, in my opinion, but, Shanna Kay certainly has been held up as the complete alibi for Nick because she says he was home with me between 5 and 5:15 p.m. that day. Now, interestingly enough, that time frame, of course, is very important because that's when the assault at the Market Street apartment takes place. So a couple of key things about Shanna Kay. Shanna Kay comes home from school. She's seen on the Potsdam High School security camera walking out of the parking lot area onto Leroy Street about 4:20, probably gets home around 4:30. And, Nick tells her about 10 minutes later, maybe 4:40, I'm going down to the high school, to allegedly watch this soccer game. And according to her, he's back home at about 5 o'clock and he leaves at about 5:15. So again, if she's telling the truth, then how could it be that he killed Garrett? All right. So interesting things about her testimony. First of all, when she was deposed in the civil case, we asked her, what did you do after that? She's like, well, I ate dinner. Oh, what did you have for dinner? And not that that's important, but I believe she said either spaghetti or pasta or something like that. Well, the interesting thing about that is at 6:24 p.m., she texts her father, quote unquote, what's for dinner? Well, why would you text your dad at 6:24 p.m. what's for dinner if you already made and ate your dinner? The bigger thing about Shanna Kay's testimony, though, was, and during the criminal trial, she testified that in the days following Garrett's murder, Nick's buddy and attorney, Manai Trifari, comes up to Potsdam, and he's talking to her about this timeline of 5 to 5:15 p.m., which is very important because, again, that's when the murder took place. But in the early days, so, October 26, 27, for a long time, it was not public knowledge when the actual attack took place. Because, again, Garrett wasn't dead when he's found. He's not declared dead for about 2 hours later over at the hospital. But Shanna Kay testifies that Mr. Trifari is focusing with her on this 5 to 5:15 time frame and ensuring that, she's consistent that dad was home then, which is fascinating because nobody knew at that point in time when the assault took place on Garrett. So how could he have known to focus on the 5 to 5:15 time frame without having knowledge of when the assault took place from Mr. Hillary? So again, that's my theory, but that's what the testimony was. And there's only one place he could have gotten that information at that point in time, because again, it was not public knowledge.
Wow. And Trifari isn't local, right? Doesn't he live in New York? Am I right about that? Or
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a pretty
You
good
guys,
friend to come all the way upstate right after this
yeah.
happens. And if you were innocent, I don't know why you would, invite your lawyer friend to help you out, and stay with you.
Well,
But okay, thank you.
there's some more things that were curious from the 24th in particular, and that relate to Manai and Nick specifically. So Nick Hillary does the practice at the college at 7 p.m. and around 8:15, and I'm off slightly on the time only because I haven't looked at these records in several years, but Mr. Hillary gets a phone call from a guy named Jeff James. Jeff is a soccer official up there. Nick knew him. He knew that, Nick had a relationship with Tandy and certainly knew Garrett. So about 8:15 p.m., he gets this phone call from Jeff James. And this is a very important time frame here because, in fact, let me pull this. I've got some stuff in my old notes here. So he gets this phone call from Jeff James, and Jeff says to him, and Jeff gives a sworn deposition to the police, I believe on the 25th of October, if not the very morning of the 26th. They'd already talked to him on the 25th. I'll finish first with what Jeff James says to Nick. He says at that time, you might want to sit down. Tandy's son was involved in an accident, and I think he's dead. And that's quote unquote from Jeff James's supporting deposition, the written sworn statement he gave to the police, I think the next day. That was at 7:54 p.m., okay? So Nick has been told by Jeff James at that point, something happened to Garrett, and I think he's dead. This is an important thing because, and Nick admits under oath that he got the phone call from Mr. James at or about that time, and that James tells him something happened to Garrett. That's all he'll concede. He says he didn't tell me he was dead. But as is Mr. Hillary's wont, he has a bizarre lack of curiosity. I mean, he gets a phone call that, hey, something happened to Garrett. He doesn't ask any questions. And he admits this to me under oath. Did you ask him any questions about what that was? Nope. Did you care about Garrett? Yep. Did you care about his mother? Yep. But you didn't ask any questions as to why it was he called you or what happened to him? Nope. How long did the conversation last? A few seconds. Oh, how nice. So the police call Nick later that evening around 9:15-ish, I want to say. And this is a recorded phone call. Lieutenant Murray calls Nick on his cell phone. And at the time, they're simply reaching out to people that knew Garrett and might have information about his whereabouts. They have no idea if Nick Hillary is involved or not involved, okay? They haven't even spoken to the guy. So Lieutenant Murray calls him it's about 9:30, 9:45, and this is a recorded call, and it's interesting because Murray says to him, hey, we were wondering if you might be able to come down to the station. Something happened with Tandy Cyrus's 10-year-old. He gets the age wrong. He never says the name. Nick doesn't, at that point, ask a police officer, what happened? Why are you calling? And, oh, wait a minute. He doesn't even volunteer that, hey, I got a call about an hour and a half earlier, was told something happened to her older son, not the younger son. Again, this surprising lack of curiosity. And he initially says, sure, I'll come down. Then he hangs up. He calls Manai Trifari, and within a few minutes, and texts him as well. And then he calls the police back and says, oh, I can't make it. My daughter's home in bed. And they're like, well, okay, we'll come see you if that's okay. So they come to his apartment roughly 9:45, 10 o'clock. And according to Nick, this is the first time he's told that Garrett is dead. But again, he never volunteers to them that he'd even heard that something had happened to Garrett from Jeff James an hour and a half, 2 hours earlier. Acts completely surprised that anything has happened to Garrett, let alone Garrett's dead. And once again, doesn't ask a single question.
Wow.
I mean, you and I both know, and anyone listening to your program, you get a phone call from somebody that says this kid who's, your ex-girlfriend's son, something happened, let alone they're dead. The first thing you say is, what happened?
Of course.
He never asks a single question of anybody, ever.
Wow. I want to actually go back to that hazmat suit. There's a lot made of that the police made him leave in a hazmat suit. Can you talk about the actual details of that hazmat suit?
It's not really a hazmat suit. It's those white I'm blanking on the material they're made of. I think it's some sort of Teflon material. But the white suits that you'll see crime scene techs walking around in, that they're all zipped up in, they're kind of like the PPE suits, I guess, for today's words. But in any event, so when Mr. Hillary, when the search warrant is issued to search him and to photograph him, it's also to take his clothes because they want to test those clothes for DNA or whatever. So the state police take his clothes and they photograph him. They can't give him his clothes back because they need to do lab testing on them. So they give him one of those suits to wear. And in fact, what the Potsdam police and the state police did for Mr. Hillary was they made sure that no one saw him leave the police station. They basically escorted him out a side door and got him in a car and had him driven away so that no one would see him, so that he wouldn't have to be explaining to anybody, why he. So the only person who saw Nick in that suit was the police, certainly, and his attorney.
And also his attorney offered to bring some clothes from, I think, her dead husband. And he chose to wear that hazmat suit. That was so shocking to me. So, he chose. He was like, no, don't bother getting other clothes for me. They were going to arrange for him to wear other clothes if he wanted to. But he goes around giving these interviews like it was this great injustice and indignity to wear this hat, to be stripped down. I mean, it reminds me of Michael Jackson's, the speech he gave after he photographed. This was terrible injustice. I had to wear this hazmat suit.
And his supporters, oh my gosh, he was stripped naked and photographed them. Yeah, they had a search warrant and he didn't cooperate. And his lawyer was with him the whole time. They presented her the warrant and they didn't do any of that stuff until she got there and had an opportunity to review the warrant. And if she felt there was something improper going on at any point, she could have objected and stopped the proceedings or whatever. But nope, she watched. Then it's on video. She's there. He and his supporters kept trying to make this out like the police were doing this all on their own, without any legal basis for it whatsoever. They had a warrant. They had probable cause at that point, as ascertained by a judge.
But he's also he claims he's not curious about it all. He never asked to see the warrant. He said he was never shown the warrant.
Yeah.
I just want to talk about this deposition. This was one of the most shocking bunch of depositions I've ever read. And I'm trying to think, I guess I've been thinking about, before this interview, how I can communicate to my audience how incredibly bizarre it is to have someone just say, I don't recall. Maybe, did you ever count how many times he says, I don't recall in these depositions?
I didn't. I'm sorry.
Okay. I don't want to exaggerate, but almost everything in I don't recall, who broke, whether Tandy broke up with me or I broke up with, I can recall every single one of my relationships who broke up with who. And I think everybody who's not suffering from amnesia can. And it just goes on and on and on. So how did you prepare for this deposition? And were you expecting this was this a strategy? Was it stonewalling? Was it hostility? Were you prepared for this?
There's two transcripts. So when I did do the actual deposition in January of 2014, I already had a 3.5-hour transcript of sworn testimony from almost 2 years earlier. So I was prepared because if you read what we call the 50H transcript, you can see how his attorney was objecting to all sorts of stuff ridiculously. So
and I'm sorry to interrupt, but he also gets very contentious with you at one point. And I can't remember. I'm kicking myself. I can't remember. Do you remember the word he calls you? He says was it hostility? Was it something else that you were?
Yeah, I probably have PTSD from that.
It reads as very, I wasn't there. I don't have a tape of it, but it reads as you were very polite and courteous. And he says something like maybe antagonizing him. So he has issues with you at one point, which I was shocked at.
He was, and if you, this is all on video. The deposition that we did in January of 2014 was videotaped on purpose, obviously. And by the way, Mr. Trifari, he filed a motion in the federal court trying to prevent me from questioning his client all over again. I think the light bulb had finally gone off in his head at that point that, oh crap, I've exposed my client to jeopardy here by doing this thing. I tried to be, professional and polite and keep my tone of voice professional and polite, particularly in the face of constant I don't recalls and his attorney making these relevance and other objections, which were completely improper. And I just elected to just, whatever. He's going to make whatever dumb objection he's going to make. I'm just going to move on with my question anyway. And I was expecting a lot of I don't recalls, Roberta, when we did the full video deposition.
Uh-huh.
This was consistent with how Trifari had obstructed back October 30th of 2011 when the state police and Potsdam PD were trying to interview Shanakay. It was, Mr. Hillary did a fair number of I don't recalls at his first testimony, but he turned it into an art form in the deposition later. And there was some question in my mind as to if you see they match up with a lot of Mr. Trifari's relevance and other objections that I think in some sense I almost wonder if they had a game plan going in. When you hear me, do the following objection, say I don't recall. But this was a plan on their part. I don't recall stuff because, as you pointed out, he doesn't recall things that he should recall, that any normal human being would recall. And it strains credulity to believe.
So I guess would like for the audience to understand. I've had some people ask me why I rely so much on the transcripts. I think what they're saying is, even though that there's punishment for lying under oath, there's no punishment for lying in a documentary, but couldn't a witness just lie under oath and kind of skate by or just have a bad memory? How does it help them and how does it hurt them? So, using Nick Hillary as an example.
Yeah, so it really didn't help Nick because we had so much information on where he was and also we knew where he was by where he wasn't. Like I said, with relation to videos, et cetera, earlier in our interview. And mind you, Nick Hillary lied about things he didn't even have to lie about. And just brief example, and has no bearing on the ultimate facts, but at 10:04 in the morning on October 24th, he goes to the Mobile Mart at 80 Market Street to buy cigarettes. Mm-hmm. When I took his testimony, what time did you get to work? 9:30. What time did you leave? 11:30. Did you ever leave the Clarkson campus at any point, in those 2 hours or so? No, I did not. And then finally, I put it on a pedestal for him. And did you not go to the Mobile Mart, at 10:04 a.m. buying cigarettes? Nope. And one of the interesting things about that is that video shows what he was wearing on October 24th. He had a very distinctive sweatshirt on, and I believe sweatpants with a logo. They never found those clothes when they executed the search warrants, and he wasn't wearing them when he came down to the station on the 26th. They were never found.
Oh, that's interesting. And so can you talk about the DNA in this case that was thrown out by the judge?
Sure.
In the criminal case, I'm sorry.
The DNA, so Garrett had DNA taken from fingernail scrapings. I believe it was one of the fingernails that had a genetic material under there that was tested by the New York State Police Crime Lab. The initial DNA testing came back, I believe it was in July of 2012. And for the type of testing they were doing at the time, they would result, the DNA profile would have 15 alleles or markers, let's call them, okay? So they certainly knew what Nick's DNA profile was because they had had his DNA from the cigarette butts, okay? They know what Garrett's DNA profile is. This DNA sample that comes back from under Garrett's fingernail is about 96% Garrett's genetic material and 4% approximately of an unknown male donor. So the initial testing in July of 2012 comes out, and of the 15 alleles or markers, they are able to extrapolate or identify 6 out of 15. All 6 match Nick Hillary's profile, but the other 9, they can't extrapolate. So kind of think of it as we have a lottery ticket from Nick, and we see Nick's lottery ticket, and we can see all 15 numbers on his lottery ticket. Then they draw 15 lottery numbers, but 9 of them are obscured when they actually draw the numbers, but we see 6. Okay, well, that's not enough to call it a match, but it's certainly curious. So newer genetic testing material genetic tests and DNA tests comes along at the state police lab, and I believe it's July or August of 2014. And now they're able to extrapolate more of the genetic profile of that unknown male donor. And now I believe they got 9 alleles All 9 match Nick Hillary, by the way. They don't match anybody else, mind you. Unfortunately, it is a destructive testing process, and that's the last of the genetic material that they were able to get from Garrett, from his fingernails. So that was the best they ever got. It's still not enough to say for sure that's the guy. So what the district attorney did, they got a company out of New Zealand called StarMix involved. So StarMix doesn't actually test the DNA. What they do is more of they compare your 9 alleles, let's say, against an overall genetic database to come up with essentially a probability of, what are the chances it's this person as opposed to anybody else in North America? And, they came up with it being like 1 in 30 million that it was anybody other than Nick Hillary. So the defense challenged StarMix, and the judge in this case, Judge Katina, and I know Judge Katina, I've tried cases before him, he ended up issuing a decision in which he found that StarMix was good science. It had already been accepted in New York courts on a couple cases before that. But ultimately, he said, the underlying data that the state police, I believe, gave to StarMix or vice versa, I haven't read the decision in several years, but basically said, well, the underlying data on which the science or the testing was done couldn't be verified or wasn't properly verified is what the defense claimed. Therefore, I have to exclude it. Wow. So he issued that decision, I believe it was day 2 of jury selection in the criminal case that that decision was finalized. And at that point, the defense said, hey, wait a second. We got a favorable judge maybe. And they elected to go with a bench trial and have the case tried before Judge Katina. And because it's in the criminal world, it's the defendant who gets to choose, do I want a jury trial or a bench trial? And they elected to abandon the jury trial. They already had, I think they had 10 jurors already selected, or 9 at that point. So, but anyway, they disbanded the jury and they went with a bench trial in front of Judge Katina. So the StarMix information, oddly enough, now you have Judge Katina who's going to rule on the case. He's seen the evidence. He knows what it says. He knows and says it's good science, but he's the guy who makes the decision to say, I'm not going to consider it, and ultimately didn't consider it when he issued his decision, whatever it was, a couple weeks later after the trial.
And that's one of the things, again, I think that was a really smart move by the defense. I don't think a jury, they would warm to Nick Hillary once they would hear some of his depositions. And one of the things that I found very, made me really angry after knowing a lot more about this case is the way that the documentary presents him as kind of like this naive, the little man against the system. And that he was really naive to it and didn't know anything about it. He seemed to be very litigious.
Oh, yeah. And, listen, it was just complete garbage that he was this naive guy who, just inadvertently or intentionally targeted by the police because he happens to be Jamaican descent. Perhaps the most interesting testimony about that issue, by the way, was from Nick Hillary himself. At the end of the video deposition, his attorney decided to ask him some questions. Why, I don't know, but he did. And he asked him a question. He said, did you believe that it was fair for the police to question you? And he said, yes. I'll be honest with you, I was expecting him to say no, and then, he'd give this long soliloquy on why, he was unfairly targeted. And he says, yes. And Trifari looks at him like, he's got 3 heads and says, all right, I'm not going to ask any more questions about that. So I, of course, then picked up that baton and went on with it. I said, because you were the ex-boyfriend of the mother of the deceased, right? Because the police would logically look to you. Of course, yes. By his own sworn testimony, he says it was fair for the police to focus on him. And, his supporters probably have never seen that testimony. And I suspect very few of them have ever, if ever, read the actual deposition transcripts, let alone watched the video of it. And, you were commenting about, I agree, it was a very smart move by his defense team to go with a bench trial. Having tried lots and lots of jury cases all over New York State, I've tried cases in Connecticut as well. I've taken jury trial verdicts, from Brooklyn all the way up to the Canadian border and well over 20 counties in between in New York alone. And I can tell you one thing that rings true with jurors is they hate liars. And when you start lying, and Mr. Hillary lies about lots and lots of things, and like I mentioned to you, he lies about stuff he didn't even need to lie about. They just start to not like you and not believe you. And I think it was a very smart move. I believe his attorneys, in response to questioning that, I don't know if it made it into the Dateline, but I think they ultimately conceded that, yeah, that deposition testimony was a bit of a problem for them, obviously. And by the way, Mr. Hillary's first criminal attorney up in the Canton-Potsdam area, he actually filed a motion to have the 50H testimony and the deposition testimony all precluded on the basis of ineffective assistance of counsel by Mr. Trifari, because Mr. Trifari hadn't properly advised him of his rights and potentially being exposed by giving testimony. And I thought that was really kind of interesting that here Nick Hillary, through his criminal attorney, says, that guy messed up.
Yeah, it was a terrible strategy. And you see in some of the language that he uses, some of his feelings towards the police department. There's one moment where he uses the word snatched when they're talking about the police grabbing his cell phone from him. And you jump on that. Why was that important to you?
It was really a very secondary issue. It was because, so there was videotape of that interaction, and it's not a snatching. He literally hands it to him. and there were two reasons. One was, I wanted to have him again talking, about a scenario that doesn't match the actual video of the incident. And secondly, he claimed that it was the Potsdam Police Department who had done this to him, when in fact it was actually one of the state police detectives who received from him the cell phone. So, he never brought a claim against the state police at any point in the original civil case. After the criminal trial, when he got acquitted by Judge Katina, he then, and it's still pending now, this whole other civil lawsuit against everybody and their brother, although I think some parts of it has since been dismissed.
Right. The lawsuit against Potsdam got thrown out. Is the lawsuit against the specific police officers, is that part of the lawsuit against the town of Potsdam, or are those separate?
So the original lawsuit, it was Nick against the village of Potsdam, and he individually named several representatives of the police department at that time. Ed Tischler, who was the then chief, Mark Murray, who was the then lieutenant detective, Charles Daniels, who was later dismissed, and Mike Ames, who's now lieutenant. I think he was sergeant at the time. So he did individually name some of the representatives of Potsdam PD in the very first lawsuit against the village of Potsdam. Most of that lawsuit was thrown out. There was a small portion. So basically, the federal judge essentially said, look, I think there's a question of fact that only a jury can resolve as to whether he was properly detained at 9 a.m. on October 26th. We know he was properly detained at 3:45, let's say, when the warrant was issued, because at that point, they absolutely have probable cause as per a judge. So there was a question of whether, 6 hours or so of spending time at Potsdam PD, whether he was improperly detained. And that would have gone to trial in 2017. But his new lawyers in a new civil case sued the village of Potsdam for all the same crap all over again. Plus, they named the state police, several state police members, people from the crime lab. They named the DAs, basically everybody and their brother. And because it was all arising out of the same series of events, what was left of the original civil case was put on hold so that the new case could get essentially consolidated with it, if you will. And then there were motions to dismiss that were filed for a lot of the parts of that new case. And unfortunately, in federal court, when you file a motion to dismiss like that, you can wait about a year for a decision, maybe more, sometimes a year and a half, which is what happened here. And then I was long gone. I had left my old firm in October of 2017 to come over and do exclusively plaintiff's work. So after that point, I was no longer involved. It was moved to another firm.
So Sara Johnson, she was a movie producer, kind of an heiress. How did she get involved in this case, and why was she so sympathetic to Nick Hillary?
I have no idea why she was so sympathetic to Nick. In my view of things, was not just a supporter of Nick, but absolutely drank the Nick Kool-Aid. I don't know what their relationship was previous. If they had one, I have no idea. But she basically bankrolled, as I'm told, his defense, and then was, I think, behind somewhat the funding or whatever of that, for lack of a better term, documentary that HBO put together, which was, I am told, quite pro-Nick, shall we say. But I honestly, I've never spoken to her, couldn't even tell you what she looks like.
Yeah, she says that, I think it's in the 2020, I'll pay as much as it takes.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that's part of why I find it so just morally objectionable that he's presented as this little man. I mean, he's the big man in this, with endless supply of money, in my opinion. And he's also incredibly lucky to have that DNA thrown out. And he goes around complaining that he lost his job because of this. What was his kind of record as a coach at Clarkson, and what kind of job did he do?
In the course of the civil case that I was involved in, among other things, we got his employment records and coaching records. And in his capacity as the head coach at Clarkson, I think he was I don't know if this is the correct way to describe it, the losingest? Is that a word? The worst losing record of any coach, I think, in the history of the program. He wasn't let go until, I think it was after he was indicted in the spring of 2014. But before that, they had already been doing these employee improvement programs, basically saying, look, the program isn't winning. The reviews from your players aren't very good. We got to get things moving in a new direction. And I think he signed off on the first one of those EIPs and then refused after that.
I think the phrase she uses is a 180-degree turnaround.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to have another losing season. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it wasn't even like it was like, oh, hey, we were 500 this, or maybe, we were one game under 500, and last year we only won one. I mean, they continued to be, terrible as far as their record. And I'm sure that stuck in his craw because Nick was a very talented soccer player. He, as he will tell you and his supporters, he was part of this national championship St. Lawrence team back in 1999 that went undefeated. Well, that has nothing to do with anything later in life other than being a nice thing to talk about. But now his record as a coach, wins and losses, he was terrible. So they eventually got rid of him. But the handwriting was on the wall long before he was indicted as far as this job for him. So
Nick Hillary's deposition unwittingly gave the police the confirmation they needed that he was the right suspect. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, before he admits to anything and goes under oath and questioning to me, the police believe that it's Nick Hillary in this light blue 2009 Honda CRV that comes into the Potsdam High School parking lot on the around 4:45 or 4:50 on the afternoon of October 24 of 2011, but they can't confirm it. And the reason for that is, first, there's a couple of people who see him in his vehicle on some of the adjoining streets, but there's nobody who they know of that sees him actually in that parking lot. They do have this security camera footage, and it's not like the movies or CSI, zoom in on the license plate, there's his license plate, or zoom in on the driver. It doesn't work that way. You can clearly see it's a light blue Honda CRV from roughly 08 to 2011 vintage. And that's about it. And you can tell there's one person in it, and when it finally parks in one of the parking spots, it appears to have a sticker in one of the back windows, as I recall, that was the same spot that Nick had one, but again, you can't zoom in on it. So until he says, yes, I was driving my car at this time and I pulled into this, parking lot, and he goes through, Roberta, and he describes and he admits to me doing all of the things that car does, which are some unique things in a sense, without me ever showing him the video. I basically got him to admit all this stuff. So now we know it's him in that car following that kid out of the parking lot. And that was huge for the police.
And in the documentary, he said, well, I did it because I had nothing to hide, right? Which I find really humorous after reading, his depositions where he says, I don't recall 700 times, maybe even more. So which is it? Do you have nothing to hide? Or, you're an open book? Or are you an amnesia? What is it? So it's an interesting statement from him. The other thing
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, he also denies in, I can't remember which deposition it was, never entering the apartment after he and Tandy broke up uninvited. But
Right.
Tandy Cyrus gave a sworn statement under oath that was quite different. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So Tandy Cyrus moves into this new apartment roughly Labor Day weekend 2011 with her two boys. Nick helps move them in. He comes over a few times after that to return some stuff of hers. I believe he described them as being in totes type boxes. However, Tandy tells the police, both in a supporting deposition to them, and then I took testimony from her in a much lengthier, sit-down sworn testimony deposition, where she describes two instances much later after this where Nick Hillary, one in particular, where she wakes up in the middle of the night to him standing essentially at the foot of her bed, uninvited. He wasn't supposed to be there. And Nick absolutely, much like many other things that other people said occurred, no, this never happened. And, I think I even asked him, I said, well, is she lying? He's like, well, if that is what she said, that's what she said, but that never happened. It was, again, one of these inconsistencies that the police find out about. And then he's saying, no, none of this ever happened. So when you compare and contrast Nick's version of everything, everyone else around his whole life was lying other than Nick. They all made stuff up, and Nick says, nope, no, none of these things ever happened. It wasn't me, etc., which, I found kind of amusing, but anyway.
Right. And you see, I mean, this is not the only case like that. You really have to be a Nick Hillary supporter. You really have to believe him. Because
and only him.
Only him, right, yeah. So do you think, I guess I'm asking you your opinion, do you think that this was a revenge tactic to kill Garrett Phillips, or do you think it was more of a plan that after Garrett was out of the picture, that Tandy Cyrus would be so grief-stricken that she would come running back into his arms?
I have struggled with that thought, those theories for years now, even going back to the whole, was this intentional? Was it inadvertent? Was he going there to just talk to Garrett to get on his good side? If you believe that he had to have been wearing gloves at the time of this because of the lack of fingerprints, and other things like DNA that you might have, although we know there was some DNA, then you have to come back to intentional. To answer, though, your question, my personal opinion is I think it was more of a, I'm going to get myself back into Tandy's, world or her orbit. I'm going to come to her rescue and counsel and comfort this grief-stricken woman. And that's how I'm going to get her back in. But, that's one man's opinion, but that's the one that seemed to make the most sense to me. I never really thought this was him going out just in revenge against Garrett.
Yeah, that's my theory too. Right after he calls Manny Trifari, is that how you pronounce his name?
I believe it's Manai.
So he calls Manai, and he runs up to upstate New York to be with him. And one of the first things they do is they go to the Watertown paper.
Yes.
So what was that meeting about? It's really unclear, in the reading the deposition, what occurred. He said he didn't ask any questions. He didn't answer any questions. What happened there?
The purpose of this was, Nick Hillary's name is out in the public, okay? He's been reported. It's a small town. We all know that. And Nick Hillary is a celebrity of sorts up there. He's like the O.J. Simpson of up there, if you will. So Manai Trifari decides, at least the way I see it, I'm going to bring Nick to the paper, and we're going to get out ahead of this. And the bizarre thing about this is they talk about, Nick, I should say, admits, yep, me, Mr. Trifari and I, we go for a meeting at the Watertown Daily Times. And he's like, well, how did the meeting get set up? I don't know. Who called who? I don't know. Did they ask you questions? Yes. Did you give any answers? No. Well, who was answering? I don't know. I mean, it was bizarre from certainly my perspective, listening to him recount this meeting where basically Trifari is the one essentially saying things to the reporter and essentially starting this narrative of this was this, case of a rush to judgment targeting this poor man, this fine, upstanding citizen, family man. And that's where it all started. And mind you, Roberta, there was There was a concerted effort over years in the public relations side by Nick's team as time went on, especially once he got the financial backing from Sara Johnson. I mean, they hired, literally a PR team, and they were leaking stuff as favorable as possible, obviously, for them to the press for years, despite gag orders both on the criminal side as well as on the civil side. In fact, I even filed a motion at one point in the civil case laying out clearly that there had been only one source of information to the press, and it had to be Mr. Trifari. It ended up being a moot point because then the criminal trial came along and everything became public pretty much. But that was the genesis, that was the start, if you will, of the PR campaign by Nick and his buddy Manai to paint this picture of these, racist, bungling cops. That's basically what it was.
And was he indicted yet? At that time? That was October 27th, right?
Yeah, it's, 3 days after the murder. Nick did not get indicted until, I believe it was May of 2015. In fact, he was indicted twice because, and we may have covered this before, but, the initial indictment, Nick's team files a motion to toss things out on the basis of prosecutorial misconduct in that the DA had gone too aggressive against his daughter in front of the grand jury. Judge Richards actually found that there was sufficient evidence to believe he'd committed the charged crime, but then agreed that, I think she went over the line in going too hard after his daughter. Therefore, you have to throw out the whole thing and start all over again. And whatever that was, 6-8 months later, after that decision came out, they impaneled a whole new grand jury, presented all the same evidence, and boom, he got re-indicted again he was indicted, I think, initially in 2014. It was dismissed late part of 2014. He was re-indicted in early 2015, and then it went to trial in September of 2016. So by the time they go to the press, this is years. He's not been indicted. He's not been arrested. It's just that his name was out there as having been questioned.
Well, isn't that a little bit of the Streisand effect? I mean, if you were an innocent person, wouldn't you have a little bit of faith in the system that you weren't going to be, indicted, that they would find the person who did this? It's just interesting to me that he went. I talk all the time on my podcast about the use of the press, the use of PR, trying cases in the court of public opinion. And I wondered if you're still reading the press about this case. And I just listened to a NPR piece that came out when some of the charges got dropped from his civil suit. And it was entirely from the defense's side.
Almost every news article that's ever been published has been from the defense side almost. I've followed them extensively. I've been quoted in many. There was a front page Sunday New York Times article, I believe it was in March of 2016. And I wrote to the reporter, I ended up meeting him months later. I wrote to the reporter after that article was published, and I said, you never once reached out to me, you know who I am, to get any alternate version of facts or whatever, because one of the things I tried to focus on exclusively was facts, provable things. I never heard back from him at the time, and the article was, to me, stunning in its assertions and even tracing these things all the way back to Nick's team. I mean, there was even one of his defense attorneys about a month or two before the trial was quoted in one of the articles saying that Garrett Phillips and John Jones had this interaction, almost altercation, if you will, in the street when he was rip-sticking back home down Cottage Street from the hospital. And I remember talking to one of the reporters who wrote that article, Roberta, and I called her up and I emailed her a copy of the video from the surveillance camera showing the two of them never even crossed paths on that street, ever. I remember her asking me, why would he make that up? And I said, that's what defense attorneys do.
Right.
They try things in the press,
right,
and they have to make things up.
Right.
And it was completely and unabashedly false.
Do you see this case and other true crime cases? I mean, do you see kind of this pattern? It seems like from Making a Murderer to Serial to, I don't know.
I wish I could say I could, but as I've said to many, many people over the years, that this case was so bizarre, so unique in many ways.
You think
that
what makes it different?
Well, the fact, and I've described this in the past, it was kind of like the OJ case backwards, where, in the OJ case, the civil case came along well after the criminal. Well, obviously the jury thought he was not guilty, but I think most everyone else on the planet thought he was guilty. When you watch the videos of OJ being deposed under oath, I mean, they deposed him for like 2.5 days. And I watched several hours of these videos. I even emailed with the attorney who took the deposition. And they have him dead to rights. I mean, it's one thing after another after another. And, this case, the Garrett Phillips case, was the reverse, where this civil thing comes along, it gets plopped in everyone's laps on the prosecution side, gift from God, basically. And it was the complete opposite, where all of this information was developed through the civil discovery process, as opposed to some of the typical where you do it through the police and DA investigative process. So that's what made it completely backwards and different from anything I'd ever seen before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just remarking on the PR aspects and sort of this kind of, using documentaries.
Gotcha.
Do you feel that this documentary that was produced, 4-hour document, it's around 4 hours, right, on HBO? It's
something
long.
Like that.
Yeah, it's long.
It was a 2-part. Yep.
Do you feel like it was produced to push things in a more favorable direction civilly for Nick Hillary?
I don't know that it will ultimately have any bearing on the outcome of the civil case. The civil case will be decided by, first, a federal judge in relation to claims that some of which have already been dismissed and more that I expect will get dismissed. I think this was strictly an effort to bolster Nick's legacy, if you will, his persona. It was clearly a pro-Nick documentary, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I know I was a part of it, and the only reason I decided and agreed to be part of it was I will always and forever will tell Garrett's story, because that's the story that needs to be told here. But I don't think it's going to help in one bit the case. And, the chances are that by the time, if anything remains from the civil case and actually goes to trial, the chances that you actually have people who saw the documentary will probably be relatively slim.
Why is John Jones not a good suspect?
Oh, John Jones. If anybody, by the way, had a defamation case, it would be John Jones against Nick and his defense team. So John Jones is not a suspect for a whole host of reasons. The primary reasons, though, are John Jones is captured on, I believe, 4, if not 5 different video cameras, walking his Labrador Retriever in the drizzle at the time the murder takes place. Yes, he goes off camera briefly for about a minute, then gets picked up on another camera, but he's basically walking on Cottage Street, picked up by the ER and the radiology cameras from Canton Potsdam Hospital. Then there was a doctor's office, Dr. Skoke's office, I think it's closed now, that also had security cameras. And he walks his dog around back through that parking lot and moseys his way back over to his house. And, he couldn't have committed this crime because he's on these video cameras at the time. And not for nothing, but John Jones, as Tandy Cyrus testified to, she said, Jonesy had this great relationship with Garrett. He loved Garrett. There was no motive. There was no opportunity. You can't be in 2 places at one time. And as I've said before, in order for John Jones to have committed this crime, he had to bring the dog with him. Because we see him leave his house with the dog and return with the dog. And nobody brings their dog to a murder, let alone jumps out a second-floor window with the dog.
Right. That's a great point.
And there you have it.
Thank you.
Oh, and by the way, his DNA didn't match and his fingerprints didn't match.
Right. So, but they want it both ways. I mean, I just briefly argued with someone online about this, and they were saying, well, it's nearby. He was nearby, John Jones. So having the dog with him is a great point. Even I didn't think of. This is one of the rare interviews where I had a chance to talk to you a little bit before this interview. I got the impression that you enjoy your work. You like being a lawyer. Is that right?
Yeah, I do. And, a case like this, when this case first came along, I remember telling my wife that I will never, ever have another case like this one. And I pour my heart and soul into all of my cases. This one, certainly more than any. I never met Garrett, obviously. Garrett had a very large impact on my life. I still go back and visit his grave every time I'm in Potsdam. He's buried in a cemetery up in Parishville on a hill next to his dad who predeceased him. And, he really touched my life. And I know it sounds weird maybe, but I kind of owe him a lot. obviously. And I feel horrible about that this young man had to go through what he went. And he fought. Don't let anyone tell you others. Garrett fought. He had abrasions on the top side of his knees where he was struggling because he's face down on the ground while he's being strangled and asphyxiated as the life is draining out of him. And he fought. And, Roberta, I've had many dreams about Garrett in this case, and I can vividly recall one of them where I was standing on Cottage Street, which runs down past the hospital from the high school to where Garrett lives. And in my dream, I'm on the sidewalk as Garrett ripsticks past me, and I'm screaming at him, "Don't go home."
Right.
He can't hear me, of course, because obviously I wasn't there, but I will never forget Garrett and his family. Like I said, he had a big impact on my life, and I did everything I could in my power in terms of my aspect of this thing to try to assist in bringing justice for Garrett. And no one will ever be able to convince me otherwise as to who it was who killed Garrett Phillips. I know in my heart of heart who did that. And I'll be happy to sit down with anybody ever. They want to come and go over the evidence from soup to nuts with me. Be happy to do it.
Tom Mortati, thank you so much for this interview. It's a good place to leave it.
You're welcome. Listen, you take care. Great being on with you. It's a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care now.